we're concerned about the child's safety because the domestic violence victim keeps going back to the perpetrator. What we would say instead is, we're concerned about the safety of the kids because of the perpetrator's pattern of behavior and their willingness and ability to get violent to the child, or in front of the child, or involve the child in their violence. And I'm not saying that domestic violence obviously is not a concern for kids, but I'm saying that if we really, really took this to heart and let it go into our practice, we would no longer write down the family has a history of domestic violence. What we would write down is, father has a history of violence and it looks like these certain behaviors. And we would tell the story of how those behaviors are harming the kids and impacting the family functioning. So we would drop out of our lexicon, the family has a history of domestic violence, the couple engaged in domestic violence, and we would identify the perpetrator. Domestic violence is not like the weather. It doesn't just happen. It's a choice or a series of choices a person makes, and they often make it in the role of a caregiver or as a parent. And so to push it even a little further is, even if the domestic violence survivor is a trauma survivor, and she grew up with violence, and she's been in 2, 3, 4, 5 violent relationships, our practice would reflect that in each of those relationships, each of those perpetrators made their own choice to get violent. The violence and the danger that violence represented to the kids was not coming from mom's trauma history. Was coming from that perpetrator's choice of violence. And so what I want to say to you is, how often have you been in rooms and situations where it will come up and somebody will say, well, you know she's been in multiple domestic violence relationships. Now I want to compare that to how many times you've heard people say, well, you know he's abused a number of women and kids. And does that really stack up in your memory about how often that comes up? He's a serial abuser. We really have to bring this to a multidisciplinary team because this is a really hard one because he's abused 3 or 4 different of our clients and their kids. And we really need to bring the team together to really look at how we're going to address his behavior. Because he's a threat to these families and he's a threat to our community. And so really when you put this to practice, it changes the way you talk about it, the way you think about it, the way you talk to clients. So really imagine approaching a domestic violence survivor from this perspective. And what it would look like. And it wouldn't look like, well, I'm here to talk to you about your relationship choices, and you need to make better relationship choices. And it would mean you wouldn't roll your eyes when she says, well, I still love him and I want to be back with him. I asked a group of child welfare supervisors once what their reaction was when a worker comes back to them and says, well, she still loves him. And to a person, they said, oh my God, what are we going to have to do? What's it going to take? We're going to have to get more aggressive here. We're going to have to get, we're going to have to look at, because they associated her love for him as being a child safety concern. Now, there's probably many people in this room who would say they love a family member who's done some bad things to them. That doesn't mean you're not aware of what they did and you don't strategize about how to deal with it. And what we've done is really sort of make victims responsible and make them really the one to blame for perpetrators' behavior. We've institutionalized, and this is about changing that institutionalization around this thing. And so what you do is you change the way, if you really practice this way, you would be able to see it in your work because it would change the way you talk to victims. So instead of saying, we're here to talk to you about making better relationship choices, we're here because your partner chose to get violent and we're concerned for your safety and the safety of your kids. And when she says, well, he's my husband, we were married, we're from a small community, we've been together 20 years, we're an immigrant community, I don't want to leave my community, I don't want, and then you get to say, you know what? Your love for him, your desire to be part of your community, those aren't problems. Our concern is your safety and the safety of your kids from his behavior. If she says, well, I want to go back to him, then the conversation is, why do you think that's going to be safe or different than before? And how do you think he's changed? Because his history indicates that he hasn't changed. Because all we're concerned about is you and your child being safe. And just imagine how that's going to be received differently than, well, this is really about the poor choices. We've looked at your case file and really have a history of picking bad men. And so really what we're talking about is shifts when we talk about this. So part of doing this shift and really being more perpetrator pattern-based, is this idea that there are multiple pathways by which domestic violence perpetrators harm kids. And in most of our systems, the conversation has begun and ended with this idea that domestic violence, so remember the scenario, many systems would be stymied by the fact that kids weren't in the room or weren't home. So you have the severe violence, people say, well, there's no nexus, there's no connection between the DV and the kids, because the kids were not present. So very much this trauma lens, that's one of the challenges around the trauma-informed initiatives. The trauma-informed initiatives, when they're put into place in some ways, makes it all about the act of violence. And that's not always the case. A lot of the work with trauma is really broader about neglect and complex trauma and goes much broader. But many times we think, when we think trauma, we think is violent incident. Did the kids see it? Did they hear it? Were they scared? Do we have post-traumatic stress disorder? You know, and so you get very narrow in the look. And so the conversations about domestic violence perpetrators and responsibility have been really stymied by this very narrow nexus. And what you have here is a much, and this is not even a complete picture, a much broader understanding of the pathways to harm, which means that it's the housing issues that he affects. I mean, when you think about a perpetrator's choice to get violent, it's the choice to expose the kids to the violence and potentially the trauma of that. It's the disruption of their daily routine that happens, the homework, the meal. They set into motion the perpetrator. The kids may have to go to grandma's house or may go to a DV shelter. They may move again. They may have to leave their friends behind. They may have to go somewhere else. The domestic violence perpetrator behavior may include going to find mom and the kids wherever they move to and then bring them back. So now we've got 2 or 3 moves that have happened because of the perpetrator's choices and behavior. Or the perpetrator's behavior leads to a loss of income because he loses a job, and that ripples through the family system. Or she can't go to work because she's injured or she's afraid, or he stalked her at the workplace. And that impacts the income. So when you start looking down on the family ecology side, you start realizing that when you deal with perpetrators' behavior as from a parent point of view, and hold them to a higher standard than we historically have, you begin to say, wow, the impact of him as a parent through his violence ripples through this family, and it ripples through in terms of affecting his partner's parenting, if she's depressed, if she has anxiety, that make it difficult for her. She has substance issues, it can undermine her authority. So what we end up seeing, and I'm going to talk more about this on Friday afternoon with the gender double standard, is we see all those things and we see her as a failed, ineffective parent who can't protect. And we don't see the face of his violence and his choice to get violent rippling through the family system. And so when you look at this, think about what does our documentation, what are the stories we're telling in our cases, in our community? When we bring up the intersectionality of domestic violence in kids, are we just saying, well, did the kids see it, hear it, or know about it? Or are we saying, well, let's look at, if we have a housing issue in this family, how did the domestic violence perpetrators, not how the domestic violence impacted, because that makes it amorphous, but how did the domestic violence perpetrators' behavior affect the family's housing? And now you can begin to see, once you conceptualize this way, your conversations with him can change. Because you could say to him now, when he says, well, the kids didn't see it, they didn't hear it, they didn't know about it going on, you could say to him, okay, so let's talk about something else then for the moment. Let's talk about how you think your violence has affected your kids academically. Let's talk about your kids and how it affected them housing-wise. You say, what do you mean? Well, your kids were living in this house and now they're living with their grandmother. How do you think that is for them? And if he says, well, you know, she shouldn't have taken them there, say, but you bring them back to his violence. And say, look, you got violence, she moved there. Are the kids with their friends? Are the kids at the same school? And you begin to both engage in that dialogue with him, but it also changes the way you talk to her. Because if she's laboring under this idea, the mother, that all this is her fault, which often is the case. And that's about the gender double standard and the gender different expectations we have, all of us have in many cases. That what we find is that shifting this language can be really supportive and empowering. And we did some work with the Advocacy Institute in Florida, and looking over there at the folks in Florida. Gia was there for the Advocacy Institute. And advocates would come back and tell stories like this one, which is when they were involved with child welfare and you asked them about their situation, they're really kind of low energy, they're really kind of upset, they're really sad. But when you said to them, talk to us about your partner's parenting choices, and his violence is a parenting choice, that we got stories that victims would feel very empowered, would feel like they had a language and a context to understand that, oh, he's making a set of choices that are impacting the kids, and this isn't about me being a bad mom, this is about him and his fathering. And so when you have this view of wider pathways, then you can do a better job doing assessment, and you talk differently with family members. So I wanted to add this in. This is something new that I started talking about recently, which is we really struggled for language about, when we're talking about substance abuse, mental health, and other issues like housing, really how to help people think about the intersectionality. Because we've seen way too many cases come in when people are not using a perpetrator pattern-based approach, where they sort of look at it and go, well, yes, there's DV in the family, but the real issue today is the kids acting out. Or the real issue now today is the housing issue. Mom can't keep stable housing. Or the real issue today is mom drops out of a treatment program. And we wanted to give you some language to really think about perpetrators' behavior pattern and these other issues. And so one way to look at it is, has the domestic violence perpetrator's behavior actually caused the other issues, like housing instability? You see in many, many cases, his choice to get violent leads to an eviction, leads to loss of income. It is the cause of that housing instability. Leads him losing his job. So that's the cause part. Has it exacerbated pre-existing conditions? So you have a mother who's a trauma survivor from her childhood or a substance abuser, and the violence of the perpetrator makes that thing worse. And there's so many different ways that could be made worse, but it could actively be, I'm going to bring drugs into the house. And I told this story yesterday about a case where he said, she was trying to get sober, she's trying to get clean, and he said, I'm going to make sure that child welfare takes your kids from your previous relationship. And because she was pregnant with his child, and he wanted it to be all about his child. And so she was working getting sober, he kept bringing drugs in the house, bringing drugs in the house, and she finally broke down and used. And as soon as she used, he actually drove her to the child welfare office and said, look at her, and we took the kids. The agency took the kids. And so that's one way of sort of exacerbating. He was bringing drugs to that. It's a very concrete, specific way. But the violence and trauma can exacerbate the mental health issues, interfere with getting, sort of can make the symptoms worse. The last one is interfere with, and what that refers to, interfere with treatment and recovery. You've got a mom who's a domestic violence survivor, who's a substance abuser. You get her to treatment. She starts going to NA, goes to AA, and he says, I'm not giving you the card because there are all those men at that meeting, and I won't be talking to other men because all they want to do is hit on you. And so he starts verbally abusing her, calling names, controlling her around her going to a meeting, and she stops going to a meeting. So there's an interference. You have kids who are referred to therapy for trauma, and the perpetrator on the weekends drives the kid around saying, where do you go to therapy? What's going on here? Show me where the therapist, don't tell anybody. And then guess what? When mom tries to take the kid to therapy on Tuesday, the kid won't come. And so that's and these things are whether the perpetrator's living in the house or not. This is really important. A perpetrator pattern-based approach, does it rest on, is he in the home or not? It rests on his influence and his tactics and what they mean for the safety and well-being of kids. So keep coming back to these words around substance abuse, mental health, housing issues, academic issues, which is, did the perpetrator's behavior pattern cause it? Did it exacerbate a pre-existing situation that was there before? And did it interfere with recovery? Because what we want to see people doing is not causing these problems, helping other people deal with their pre-existing issues. Is in a good, healthy family, we see partners helping their partner get sober and supporting them engaging in the process that they need to do to be a better parent. But this is the opposite that often happens when we're talking about DV perpetrators. So here's a summary of when we're talking about a perpetrator pattern-based approach, some of the key issues. It looks at perpetrators' behavior, not the relationship, as the source of the domestic violence risk. And has this really broad understanding that's not just coercive control, but it's actions taken to harm the kids, using kids as spies, undermining her parenting, using kids as a weapon against the other person. If you leave me, I'm not going to give you a penny for the kids. And so it really kind of looks at that perpetrator's behavior pattern as the source, not the relationship. It highlights the choice to be violent, abusive, and controlling as a parenting choice. So one of the things that we really kind of identify is using the language around it. It's a choice-making process. And then this is a parenting choice. And I want you to try on while you're here, if you haven't already, that when he gets violent to his partner, even when the kids aren't present, that's a parenting choice. And the way we come to that is it's reasonable for him to know that being violent to his kid's mother is bad for his kids, even if the kids aren't in the room. And it's about raising standards for dads. It's about raising standards or expectations around domestic violence. And so it's a parenting choice. And try on that language and see how that feels to you. And it's beyond the current relationship. It's a 360-degree assessment of perpetrator pattern. So it's relevant what he did to his last girlfriend or the girlfriend before that. If we're doing an assessment of child safety based on a perpetrator pattern, and this is much more like a sex offender in this way. Because we would want to know if somebody perpetrated against another kid, right? You wouldn't say, oh, this isn't not in this family. We don't want to know about what he did to another kid. You would say, oh yeah, tell me what he did to this other kid or this other family. That's a pattern-based approach. And so we really want to be thinking about, if we're assessing today what's going on with this kid and this family and child safety, we want to know. So look at your processes and think about, where do we pull together the information we have on the perpetrator? One of the things we were talking about yesterday was, one of the barriers is child welfare cases are opened up in mother's name usually. And so it feels, it looks like everybody, the case is about the mom, no matter why it came in. And so you really have to think about, when in meetings are we asking the questions about his behavior and other relationships and making that meaningful to our assessment of child safety today. And I can tell you tons of cases where you can see his pattern. I mean, one of the cases was, in one relationship, he said, we had a report, he said to the kids, hey kids, come in here right now, watch me kill your mother. And then in another relationship, he said, we had a report saying, he said to the woman, this is the day your kids are going to watch you die. This is his pattern across relationships. Another guy who would get women involved criminally and make them vulnerable so they couldn't reach out for help. And so you got to ask yourself, in my system, how perpetrator pattern focused are we? Are we incident based? We're relationship based? Where do we ask the questions? Where does that information come together? And then the last bit is, it's more than adult on adult behavior. It's about creating a strong nexus, telling a strong story about how the perpetrator harms the kids, and not making it just about that the kids see or hear it, but really, how did the perpetrator affect the family functioning through their behavior? And is that written down and documented? And this is really about, I'll talk more about this Friday afternoon, but my belief is we feel comfortable commenting on mother's dress, relationship, where they're living, their job, as part of how we assess her as a parent. Does that make sense? We assess men much more narrowly. Are you working and you're paying child support? And built into that double standard, those different expectations, is one of the barriers to doing this last bit, which is really seeing how fathers who are violent really how their behavior really disrupts the family functioning. And telling that story in a meaningful way in our documentation, in our case presentations, in court, back to the family, back to the victim. Because part of the value of this, even if you never work with the perpetrator directly, part of the value of a perpetrator pattern-based approach is the ability to talk back to the victim and say, you know what, from our perspective, it looks like he's done a lot of undermining of your family functioning. It looks like he's done a lot to disrupt your discipline. It looks like he's done a lot to disrupt your housing. It looks like he's done a lot to disrupt your education.